Muy buenos días a todas y todos. Les doy la bienvenida a este último webinar del primer ciclo de nuestra serie Socias y Codesarrolladoras, un nuevo rol para las comunidades en proyectos de energía renovable, una iniciativa financiada por UK Pact y ejecutada por la Fundación Ideas para la Paz, Meligina y Connectivity. A lo largo de esta serie hemos abordado distintas dimensiones del modelo de copropiedad comunitaria, su marco conceptual, los aprendizajes internacionales y los desafíos institucionales y sociales. Hoy cerramos el ciclo abordando un elemento determinante para su viabilidad, el acceso a capital y la estructuración financiera que permita transformar una intención en una operación concreta y bancable. Uno de los principales obstáculos que enfrentan las comunidades que desean participar como socias en proyectos de energías renovables no es conceptual, no es técnico, no es jurídico. La mayoría de las veces es financiero. ¿Cómo se estructura una garantía de crédito que funcione para todas las partes? ¿Cómo se distribuyen los riesgos de manera equilibrada? ¿Qué criterios técnicos y financieros evalúan los bancos? ¿Y bajo qué condiciones un esquema de propiedad compartida puede ser considerado viable desde la perspectiva del mercado? Para responder estas preguntas, hoy contamos con una invitada de altísimo nivel, Chana Martineau, CEO de Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation en Canadá. Bajo su liderazgo, se han estructurado mecanismos de garantía que han facilitado más de 22 millones de dólares en financiamiento para proyectos energéticos con participación indígena, reduciendo el riesgo percibido y creando las condiciones institucionales claves para el acceso a capital. La conversación de hoy no es teórica, es una conversación sobre arquitectura financiera, instrumentos de mitigación de riesgo, criterios de evaluación crediticia y condiciones habilitantes para la replicabilidad de este tipo de modelos en contextos como el colombiano y el latinoamericano. La conversación será moderada por Juan Dumas, cofundador de Meligina y socio de este proyecto, quien guiará el diálogo hacia los elementos estructurales del modelo y su posible adaptabilidad al contexto colombiano. Antes de iniciar, vamos a dar algunas recomendaciones prácticas. Recordemos que este es un subwebinar y que por lo tanto contamos con un bloquecito, un botón de preguntas y respuestas donde pueden ir a lo largo del webinar dejando sus preguntas y trataremos de resolverlas directamente vía escrita o algunas de ellas serán contestadas directamente por nuestra experta. También informarles que contamos con traducción simultánea del español a inglés y inglés a español y en la barra inferior pueden en el icono del mundo pueden escoger cuál es su idioma de preferencia para escuchar el webinar. Y al final, como les mencionaba, tendremos un espacio dedicado a preguntas y respuestas, esperando que nuestra experta pueda dar respuesta a la mayoría de ellas. Con esto, damos inicio formal a una conversación fundamental para avanzar en la reflexión conceptual hacia la estructuración financiera concreta de modelos de copropiedad comunitaria. Shana, thank you very much for joining us today. Juan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maria Paula, and thank you so much, Chana. This is such a privilege for me and for us and for everybody who has connected today. I think you're muted. There you go.
Apologies. Thank you so kindly for those kind words and the warm introduction, Maria Paula. I wish my Spanish was a little faster. It takes me a while to follow you, but I'm thrilled to be here to have this conversation with you today.
Wonderful. So, Chana, let's dive straight into it. You are a member of the Frog-like Nation, and at the same time, you have a very successful career in finance
Yes.
with 2 degrees in banking. And you have a job today where you're the CEO of the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, which seems to be cut out for you, right?
Yes.
So, can you give us a brief introduction to the AIOC, its history, what it does, and what it means to you to be the CEO
Yeah.
of this institution?
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Juan. And very nice to be with all of you virtually today. So, the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation was started in 2019. And, not unique to Canada, Indigenous communities, as a result of legacy colonialism, have suffered economically in our country. And that has been from systemic barriers due to the Indian Act that was put in to manage Indigenous peoples under the British colonial rule. And that act is still in place today. And one of the restrictions in that act is that Indigenous people cannot borrow, they cannot hold collateral for property on reserve because it's Crown land. You cannot hold collateral, you cannot seize collateral. And so through the generations, that has created this barrier in access to capital. And when you think about how anyone accumulates wealth, how businesses grow, you need to be able to borrow and access money. So without this, Indigenous people have been held back. It's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons. And so what this program was designed was to, rather than reconstitute the act, was designed to create a bridge to that access to capital in a new way. And so we used the strength of the Alberta balance sheet in a guarantee format. So like a co-signature on a mortgage, if you have those kinds of things in your countries, like a co-signer on a mortgage to backstop the capital access and also to get a preferred lending rate. So at a very close to a government rate. And so the reconciliation part is that there's more net income flowing to the communities and they have this access to capital. So both of those elements. Our organization was designed to facilitate those transactions and support those transactions through capacity grant funding, through loan guarantees against it's a sub-sovereign jurisdiction in Canada, the province of Alberta. And so when you say this was uniquely designed for me, this role, or, many Indigenous people have not sought higher education in our country. I was very fortunate to be able to go to university. I was the first in my very extended family. My grandfather was one of 13 and my dad was one of 7. And I was the first one to have the opportunity to go to university. And I really felt the weight of making the most of that opportunity. I did a career in banking and accounting through a Big 4 firm, Ernst & Young, and then back to some more banking. But I always had this calling to help Indigenous peoples that wasn't being served in the positions that I was in. And so I ended up becoming the CEO of this organization when it was launched. It's something that I'm really deeply passionate about, is helping my people to a brighter economic future and Indigenous peoples right across our country.
Some things are just meant to happen.
Yes, I think so. I say that it's a calling more than a job sometimes.
Yeah, you definitely sound like that for sure. So you mentioned this idea of a mortgage-like instrument, but maybe one thing we can do is put up a slide so that you can walk
Sure.
us through how a
Yes.
loan guarantee works.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. If you can, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, let's ask Valentina if
And,
she can do that.
and so what I think is important while that's happening is that the loan guarantee, in my mind, it works differently from an infrastructure bank in that it doesn't interrupt the cycle of capital. So you will see on the I just want to translate here. So in the middle, in the gold box there's an opportunity, an acquisition or a project.
Yeah.
And or in the blue box. And then the Indigenous groups borrow the money for that investment. And the lenders still lend money just like they would. So the banks on the top right-hand side there, they still lend and go through their normal processes. But that debt is supported by AIOC as the guarantor rather than the Indigenous groups themselves. And so there's many reasons why this can be challenging. Previous access to capital, lack of assets, lack of credit history, all of those things make it challenging to access that capital. But the rest of the credit cycle works in the normal way. Distributions pay the loan and then get paid to the Indigenous group. That way, you're not having the revenue streams go through the general business revenues of the Indigenous group and then pay the debt. The debt payments are paid and then the groups get the net distributions to use as they want. And in Canada, the government funding is very tied to specific projects, to specific outcomes. The First Nations in our country don't have the flexibility to choose, say, if they need more money for business projects than for housing investment, they don't have their grants are all tied to specific streams. So they don't have the opportunity to make sovereign decisions about how they would spend their funds.
Great. So this makes a First Nation group that would otherwise not be credit worthy.
Yes,
This means that now they can access the capital they need to invest in the equity of significant projects happening in their lands or in their area.
yes, yes. And then also that gives them um, the economic opportunity. These are long-term opportunities. So I see that you have on the slides here, we have windmills, right? So long-term projects that provide real returns today, but also provide very long-term returns so that the communities can then count on those revenue streams and they can take those funds and reinvest them into other economic growth. They can invest them into their community. One of the communities that we worked with took their revenue streams and they built a large community center. They had no arena, no community gathering hall. And so they built a structure so that people could participate in healthy activities, as well as you could have meetings and gatherings there, weddings and the like. Um, and what a healthy center that is from the community that they didn't have that before. My own community is building water infrastructure, paving a road. These are foundational infrastructure items that weren't available, and that is all coming from the revenues from our project.
That's fantastic. And aside from loan guarantees, you provide capacity building as well for the
Yes,
communities that come to you. Why do you do
yes,
that?
yes. Okay. These deals are very large, very complex. So I use a very simple example of a mortgage on a home, and it's like that, but en masse. You think about hundreds of millions of dollars instead of hundreds of thousands of dollars, and big complex projects like power generation facilities. Um, and you're working with and partnering with multinational corporations. And so there's a level of expertise and complexity that is required to assess, navigate, negotiate, and close those transactions. So we provide capacity in actually two ways. One, we provide funding for the First Nations or the Métis groups to hire advisors, so they can hire lawyers, they can hire financial advisors, they can hire bankers to help them source the debt, to negotiate a great rate and appropriate deal terms. The other is that we support from an intellectual capacity standpoint. So we go on the journey with them and provide our opinion in addition to the advisors. We help the negotiations, we help the translation, because the way that the First Nations do business and the way that the corporations do business, they're not always compatible. And so sometimes the two sides need help speaking to each other and finding a way through the complexity of the transaction that works for both sides. And that may not look exactly like a transaction between two corporations or between two First Nations. There's I talk about there's some creativity and some perseverance required. And so we bring our knowledge from these other partnerships that we have done to help the parties involved find a path through.
That's great. And I wanted to ask you, who brings a deal to your table? Is it usually a company that says, "Hey, I want to partner with this First Nation group," but they don't have the capital, or is it the First Nation group that comes to you and says, "Hey, we're in the middle of this negotiation with this company, and we need your help"?
Yeah. So I would say in the beginning, it was far more the corporate partners. And I think this is a learning curve. And so the corporate partners, and I think there was a long desire in Canada to partner with Indigenous groups, but there was no mechanism with which to do it. And so often the corporate partners have said, hey, we want to bring our neighbors in. Here are some of the ideas that we have. What might work under the umbrella of your program? And we would provide them advice and also provide them advice, especially in the early days. There was a lot of trepidation, cautiousness about approaching the Indigenous partners. They didn't want to offer something if they didn't know it could close, that they could get it to the finish line. And there was a lot of fear of harming the relationships by having a failed deal. And so we were able to provide some comfort that yes, this could fit the program, our parameters, and we will help you with those conversations. And so that gave a lot of comfort. As we've gone on, and I think we're still growing, we have found that First Nations are starting to lead projects and they're starting to bring us more opportunities. There's a few things that go along with that. It's understanding what might fit a loan guarantee, and we have a low risk tolerance. So what does that mean, and what can that fit? You know, Bitcoin. The nations wanted to invest in Bitcoin. We said no. That's just an example. But you know, you need some predictability of revenue stream. You need ability to meet the debt. So there was a learning curve. And now what we saw earlier in the past 12 months, we were able to close Duchess Solar, a solar project where that was First Nation led. Cold Lake First Nations led that project front to beginning, front to end. They found a corporate partner to help them to build the facility and so on. And so we're seeing more and more of that. And every time a nation does a transaction, they learn. There's really deep learnings, and because you know, you don't get these skills overnight. They're complex.
That's true. And one thing we're seeing is that actually maybe the first deal for a First Nation is not the most profitable one of them all, but the second deal that they do is
Right,
actually better because they're using the experience and the leverage from the first one
right.
onto the next one. Do you have the same experience?
We have a principle that our deals need to be at market terms.
Yes.
So there's always a range of market terms, and there's always trading off. But what I would say is, so we won't support a deal that we don't feel is at fair terms for the Indigenous peoples. But what I would say, so that is, we've had to step in and say this is not a fair value before, you know, not, and it's been a negotiation, but everyone wants to get the best price for their assets, right? Um, but what I would also say is that sometimes the nations, because all of our transactions are 100% financed, so there's no down payment, no injection of capital. It can take time before those returns really start showing. And
Exactly.
so what I say is think about the cumulative returns. You're not necessarily buying for returns on day one, but what does that mean to you over years? We talk about IRRs and levered IRRs and unlevered IRRs to help translate that to, you know, what kind of return, help the nation see that from a truly, you know, the same way that an infrastructure investor would look at something. And then also, what does that mean to you over time? Where we've seen nations really have impact is when they've stacked multiple deals. So if you're starting to have, you know, one deal, one transaction might give you $200,000 a year, which doesn't seem like a lot. What can you do with that? But it's $200,000 a year over the next 20 years and beyond, right? And then all of a sudden, if you do two or three, you know, we have one nation that's north of $1 million a year in net return. And then if you reinvest that capital, what can that mean for your community? It can mean a lot.
Yeah, exactly. So we have some people in the room who
Hmm.
are finance experts.
Yes.
So let's go a little bit deeper down that road.
Okay.
And and so one of the challenges usually is the complexity of deals. Like usually
Yes.
investors want to see simpler deals rather than more complex deals. And here, like the spread, has to be significant for it to work for the
Hmm.
community, right? So in
Hmm.
your experience, what have been sort of the financial aspects that make these deals work, and what's a red flag for you?
Mm. Okay. Well, we like to have long-term contracts to the extent that we can. And so we've lengthened amortizations for assets that have long life assets. You know, if you have a pipeline, it's easily a 50-year asset. So it's not hard to do a 25, 30-year loan against that, right? Um, the complexity for us is often the Indigenous communities are a consortium. So then the corporate partner looks and says, well, I have to deal with 7 partners instead of one. I want to deal with one person, make it easy for you. So you'll see, and we have this slide a little bit later, I think, and we can share it with your group. But we have a document that describes how you can go about these transactions and how you can narrow it down to a handful of representatives negotiating on behalf of the whole. So this is available on our website. you're welcome to have a look at it. We don't have it translated to Spanish, unfortunately, but maybe someone can do that as long as you give us attribution. But it really talks about, we worked in systems where a group of nations will elect or appoint a representative to negotiate on behalf of the whole, or 2 or 3 people or 5 people to negotiate on behalf of the whole. And then typically we help to equip those people with the knowledge that they need or with advisors to support. So all of that reduces the complexity and brings it more on par to commercial terms. It's never going to be exactly that way, but it's also a learning journey for the corporate partners. They need to understand the perspective of the Indigenous communities. And I do really firmly believe that the corporate leaders are better executives and better people leaders as a result of their learnings and knowledge of Indigenous people. You bring better values. If you read the Harvard Business Review at all, and their articles on leadership are all very base Indigenous values around relationship, around humility, around listening and honoring your colleagues. And so, I say that everything old is new again. We have a lot to learn from the way that First Peoples have traditionally worked together.
I agree. You have been very generous with us because you have asked Scott and Steve from your
Yeah,
team to
yeah,
help us check some of our hypotheses for the fund that we are raising for communities
yeah.
to have access to capital to invest in projects. But you've always said that despite all the the financial expertise, that's the easy part, and that the more difficult part and the most important bit is the relationship. Why
Yeah.
is that?
Well, Indigenous people are long-term investors. They're not here to buy and sell assets. They're not a private equity fund that are looking for a short-term return. They want to be your long-term partner, and they will live and work and play in and around your assets and in that geographic footprint for time immemorial. They have been there since time immemorial. Our connection to the land is just so deeply held that my daughter has it without even understanding why she has it.
Mm.
And so there is just a way of being there so many investors just want to make their return and be out in 5 to 10 years, and that is not the case. Indigenous people want to be your partners typically for a lifetime or longer.
Right. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And so here in this part of the world, when we share the story of Canada and the
Yeah.
experience of Canada, some of the reaction we get is, oh, you're bringing us an example from a developed country. The indigenous
Mhm.
people there are, they work together very easily. They agree on things all the time, and it's easy for them to do these kinds of deals. But you've told some stories that
Yeah.
show that it's not that easy. And then could you
Oh
give us some
no.
examples?
Yes, I can. So Canada is a developed country, yes. But if you have any knowledge of our First Nations reserves, of our Inuit people, um, our outcomes are far from a developed country, very far. Our levels of education, every social metric you want to have, we are very far, far from a developed country. And I think of it this way: when you have so few economic opportunities, you're fighting over economic morsels, tiny crumbs at the table, just tiny pieces. And so when you're fighting, like dogs over just a morsel of food, of course you don't get along. And the same is true, honestly, in Canada. Our Indigenous people have been so held back from opportunity that we were fighting over economic morsels. And so what I have seen in more than one transaction is, um, neighboring groups that didn't get along because they were fighting for the limited economic opportunities that they had. And among other things, politics always gets in the way. Number one rule of any economic development for me is to keep the politicians and the economics separate, focus on the economics and the opportunity, and let the politicians manage the politics. So there's all of those components. But I shared with you one of the earlier deals that we did in the region that I'm from, in that Cold Lake region. And my dad said to me, Chana, I never thought I would see the day that the Cree, the Dene, and the Métis were doing a transaction together. And yet here we are all celebrating. And another transaction in another part of the province, around the Tamarack Valley project that Juan, you and I have talked about a lot, that we had invited 14 or 15 of the region's communities to participate. And at the beginning, they said, this is going to be hard. We don't get along. And they weren't wrong. It was a hard one, absolutely. And there was lots of tension along the way and lots of, struggle for agreement and those kinds of things. But we found our way through. And one of the things I'm most proud of is that a couple of the leaders at the celebration, the closing celebration, stood up and said, we came in here not as friends, but we're leaving here as friends and knowing how to work together. And that same consortium is now looking at other economic opportunities together. And that is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life.
Oh, a great story. So you just mentioned how important it is to separate business from politics. That was going to be my next question.
Yes.
Can you give us a little bit more detail why that is so important?
Okay. I think that politicians have to answer to the people, and everyone is their stakeholder. Everyone has a vote and can influence whether a politician is successful or not. In business and in economic development, I think we have to be relentlessly committed to quality opportunities. And so what that means to me is that there's lots of great ideas out there, but that doesn't mean that they're a great economic or a viable economic opportunity. And so we need to be very relentlessly focused on the very best opportunities and making sure that the Indigenous people advance. But the politicians need to be able to support a broad range. And so our interests are not exactly aligned. And so how I've worked with politicians is, there's things the politicians disagree on. Like, so in Canada, we have many arguments and there's many court cases about treaty rights of First Peoples. There's the Métis that don't have treaty rights. They have a different set of rights, and they would like to move more to First Nations, and who should have what, all of those pieces. Those things just get in the way. Those are very long-term questions that need to be answered by the courts. So you have the politicians who need to appeal to as broad a swath as possible, and then you have the economic focus, which is very narrow. And so the agreement that I've said to our politicians is we have two different constituents groups. So we will assess and say no. We will find the good opportunities, and you all know how many opportunities you have to look at to find a good one. They don't grow plentifully. And so you must be relentlessly focused on the best ones and not lose money for the nation or the Indigenous peoples. And then the politicians can, there's many other programs from my perspective that can support grassroots economic development, that have a higher risk tolerance, that are trying to spur innovation. Those aren't what our program is designed to do. And so we need to stick to what we are doing. And also politicians are often not deeply connected or understanding to some of the risks that are involved to manipulating deal terms. If you get suboptimal terms, I'm a big believer that the capital markets are efficient and that you will get to the best outcome by letting them work the best, which is why we have the slide about not interrupting the cycle of capital. I think that's really, really important. And in organizations I've seen where we, not to disparage, but where we've seen a bureaucrat picking winners and losers, I often think you're skewing the capital markets. And I think that long-term can create more troubles.
Got it.
I hope that's not offensive to anyone.
No, it isn't. I think it is very helpful because you're speaking from experience and
Yeah,
practice. You've seen this. It's not
right,
theory behind a
right,
desk, right?
right. Yes, yes. And so we can we can we can see the how it can impact a deal later if you make choices on the front end when you're negotiating a transaction that others with less expertise might miss, right? And
Right.
many of our
And which,
politicians are not finance people.
right. So it's you make some decisions that look good for politics, but are
Right.
very bad for economics on the long run, in the long run.
Agree. Agree. And I think in the long run, none of us wins. The indigenous
Yeah.
people, the governments themselves can lose money that way, right? It's a quick win, and it's sort of like having a candy bar for a snack, takes you longer to work it off than it did to eat it.
So, Shana, the guarantee model is
Mhm.
expanding. The instrument is expanding in Canada.
Mhm.
The AIOC was not the first one. There was a program in Ontario, but you are
Yes,
certainly the leaders today in terms
yes,
of deployment and the
yes.
amount of capital that you're catalyzing. But now Saskatchewan has their own instrument.
Hmm.
And most importantly, the federal government came up with their own loan guarantee program. And I believe BC is thinking about one as well,
Yes,
right?
yes.
So uh, what sparked this growth in guarantee programs? Like what sort of stood out from your experience that has inspired so many others?
No, well, thank you for that. I think success, really, I think the Alberta program was really successful. And why I think that is I think we have business people and Indigenous people operating the corporation, that we have separated ourselves from the politics, and we move more at the speed of business, and we talk in business terms about partnerships and work our way through that. I think the Alberta government really found that this was an amazing tool, not just for Indigenous reconciliation, but also for just core economic development, that they can get more done with Indigenous people at the table versus fighting against each other. We're stronger together. And so I think all of that has morphed into, wait a second, we want to do that too, right? And so Alberta has shared our knowledge with the federal program, with Saskatchewan, with Ontario and others. The Ontario program has morphed to be more like ours. Um, and we are charged with a mandate of, driving more. We don't just wait for applications to come in. We go out, we talk to companies, we talk to communities. We're trying to source more opportunities. So we're actually proactive in making this happen. But I think when you're driving economic opportunity into centers that haven't been traditionally prosperous, the entire fabric of the country is stronger, right? Because you're turning what would be an economic um, uh, drain to an economic generator. And so I think, and then we're all stronger and more prosperous as a result. So I really think when people have hope, when people in those communities have hope, then I think the social outcomes, there's much trouble with fentanyl and other narcotics on our reserves, more so than the cities even. Um, the health outcomes are less, but when people have hope, I think you start to change that cycle and you start to create a positive trend, and then it can build on each other.
And have you had any deal that went wrong and the state had to honor the guarantee?
Not yet. So we've been in existence 6 years. It's not a long time, but we have not had that as of yet. We assume that that will happen at some point, but we have no line of sight to that yet. So, you think you can do it with careful portfolio construction and careful negotiation of terms. We put in reserve accounts and, debt service coverage ratios and different things to help us all be more assured that the debt will be repaid. But we have had one greenfield project. They had cost overruns, so there was a debt provisioning structure there where the Indigenous communities were borrowed from the financial partner and are paying back. So their distributions are delayed. The loan is being repaid, so we're okay with that. But the return on the capital is taking a few years longer than they planned because of cost overruns. So we've done things like that to try to help mitigate the risk to the balance sheet for the jurisdiction.
Right. Yes, you're protecting the taxpayers' money, and
Right.
that probably
And
means
helping,
that,
yes, and
yes,
helping Indigenous people and helping them all of a sudden to spark new projects too, because investors are more keen if they think that projects can get done. So for a long time, I think in Canada, and I think international investors still think, can you really do this? Have you really resolved these issues? And so we say, yes, look, Indigenous people are at the table now, and we can do this. So it's very exciting.
and that's the exact reason why we're doing this webinar, because
Mhm.
you might inadvertently be inspiring other countries in our region to
Yes.
actually follow you on your experience.
I I hope not inadvertently. I hope there are people that leave inspired, and we know that we've had reach outs from Australia and Japan and others around the same program. And I really, the legacy of colonialism is evident really across our globe. It's not just in your region or in Canada. It's everywhere, right?
True, true. So I can see we have a few questions coming in. So
Sure.
I'm going to ask you my
Okay.
last question for the moment.
Okay.
And then I'll hand it over to Maria Paula to lead on the questions. But my question to you is, you Canada has seen 30 years of testing and try and error, but then scaling up equity
Mhm.
partnerships with Indigenous communities across all sectors, not only in the renewable energy sector, which is the focus of our work, but
Yes.
we've seen it in forestry and in so many other things. And even your sectors have expanded, right? You were in
Hmm.
energy, and now you're in
Yes.
agri, in tourism, in technology, and so many other things. So it seems to be like a very exciting time, right? What does it look like for you? What's your vision for the next 30 years for Canada?
Well, I am so excited, and I think your countries can follow suit very quickly because you can build from the learnings of where we've been. But I really see, um, in Canada, we're talking in response to the Trump tariffs, we're talking about really building major infrastructure at a scale and a pace that we haven't in decades and generations. And so I think this is an opportunity, and my organization will support Indigenous investment under these major projects. And so for the first time, Indigenous people will be fully at the table. When we built the railroads in the late 1800s and early 1900s, Indigenous people weren't owners in those assets. When we built highways in different pieces, Indigenous people were not there at all. And now we have an opportunity to benefit economically alongside our country as a whole from the efforts that we'll be making. And so I'm excited for your countries to be able to participate in a similar fashion and really build from the learnings. And it won't take you 30 years to be able to do this. I think you can do it very soon.
I hope it doesn't. Yeah, I'm
I
into
hope it
I'm
doesn't
into
too. You all on this webinar have the power to make that happen.
Yeah, true. That's what keeps us waking up every morning.
Yes.
Uh, so, Shana, for the moment, I'll hand it over to Maria Paula, and then we will finish it together. Right.
Shana, thank you very much. We have a question here from our public. I will read it in English because I understand you're
Okay.
in channel English of translation.
Yes.
So the question is, maybe this is a very Colombian situation, but maybe you have addressed a similar situation in Canada. Have there been any challenges in identifying these communities? How has it been verified that the potential agreement encompasses and represents the entirety of the community's members? We understand that situations may arise where, despite having entered into an agreement with a community, additional individuals or groups subsequently claim to be members of that community or part of another stakeholder group. Has this occurred in your experience, and how have such situations been managed?
Okay, there's a lot in that question. So thank you very much to the person that posed it. I will tell you, first I'll explain how community membership works in Canada. So the community membership is managed by the band and each band or the Métis organization, but I'll speak in terms of First Nations. It's the easiest frame of reference for me. And these issues are complex, so we could be here for another hour just talking about this. But the band manages their membership. in conjunction with the federal government. So you have to prove your ancestry to be able to belong to a band, and then the band has to agree with your proof that you are in fact a member. So we leave that between the band and the federal government. Again, leaving the politics and some of those things aside, we don't get involved in that part. The second is the First Nations and the Métis groups have assigned land. So under the Indian Act, we all had certain assigned land. And then there's traditional territories that overlap each other and go beyond those boundaries. So we usually start with the assigned lands, and then the government has regulations and parameters around considerations for the traditional territories. And so when we look at that, we ask of our corporate partners that they are inclusive in their approach. So one of our foundational principles is fairness. So no one group can have an advantage access to either financing or to economic opportunity over the others. But we don't enforce it. We ask it to be fair. We require the corporation to give us a plan that is representative of the fairness treatment. Sometimes that has meant if they have a very adversarial relationship with a community that might be in that territory, and they say we won't include them because we are at odds over something else, or we can't work with them, or what have you, we will accept that rationale. But we always also say you must, as your corporation, be able to defend your choices for partnership with your company values. Remember, we support those partnerships, and I'm lifting my hands up. We support the partnerships. We are not a full partner at the table. And so it is really, really important. We have had situations where 2 times where 4 First Nations were approached, or First Nation and Métis, and they felt a neighboring community should be at the table and was left out. And in both of those situations, the 5th community ended up participating in the transaction. Once at the invitation of the Indigenous communities, they split their share to include them. Once the corporate partner increased the allocation to accommodate on the same level, and once the others just said, no, we feel strongly that our neighbors should be here, and we will split the pie 5 ways instead of 4, which I think was amazing. It doesn't always work that way, but some really good outcomes. Did I get all of the parts to that question? Okay.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much. We have 2 more questions. The second one is that it's the next one. From your experience, structuring credits and credit guarantees to enable Indigenous equity participation in medium and large-scale energy projects, what are the minimum institutional and financial conditions that must be in place for such a model to be credible and bankable in a context like Colombia?
Ooh, well, my context on Colombia is a little bit limited, so I will. But what I will say is our process isn't much different than any other bank would take, right? So you want to look at covenant provisions, you want to look at debt service coverage ratio. We still take collateral, like physical collateral on a pipeline or a power plant, those kinds of things. You want to have some coverage against payments. You want to understand the asset retirement obligations of the asset. What are the environmental considerations? We look at all of those things alongside and with the banks, and we think that is a prudent process for the nations to take as well. They need to understand it is ultimately their partnership. We are supporting them to access the capital, but this is ultimately their investment. And so one of the things I've spoken about with the nations and the Métis groups is just, understanding the difference between being a business owner and just having impact benefit agreements. You now need to act as an investor and an owner in this business. And so what does that mean? Does that mean, we've had conversations where people have said, well, we want 100% procurement. We want 100% of the opportunities for servicing or providing contracts. Well, as the business owner, you need to pick the best possible provider, and your opportunity is to drive profit. So sometimes those priorities can be at odds with each other. So you need to, in the context of the investment that you're making, you need to act as a business owner. And so these are all important changes.
Thank you, Shana, for your comments. And we have a last question. It was made by Luis Sanchez. It's on the Q&A of our webinar. It's in Spanish, but I will make it in English for you. I would like to know whether the impacts on the directly affected indigenous communities have been assessed, particularly regarding their opportunity to access and manage financial resources without intermediation. Like they can make their own directly assessment of resources or credits and guarantees.
Yes. So every transaction that they undertake builds capacity. I think there's still advice is always necessary, right? It doesn't matter. Even corporate partners seek advice, legal terms, financial terms, operational impacts. Everyone needs advice. No one can understand in depth all of those pieces. But I do think every transaction materially moves forward the business knowledge of the people involved. But also for a community, sometimes only one of their members is, or one chief and council or one of their economic development people are at the table. So you need more than one person in your community that understands. And so that transitioning, that building of knowledge, it takes time. In our country, the indigenous people that often got education that are sort of at my age-ish or my generation often went into law. And so we have more indigenous lawyers than we have indigenous financial people. And so, the knowledge is coming and communities are moving ahead quickly. And they're catching up very rapidly. We've seen communities come up the curve tremendously in even just 5 years, but there's still a ways to go. And there's so many that are just, at the very beginning, looking over the edge, wondering, how are they doing this?
Shana, thank you very much. We have no more questions in our Q&A. So I think it's time to make a closure. Maybe Juan, you would like to make some last words. And Shana, maybe you would like to say a few words to say goodbye to our audience.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. I actually want to ask you one more question, Shana.
Oh, okay, sure. If we have time. Yes, of course.
We have a bit of time. Yeah, I wanted to ask you two very quick questions. The first one is, when do people approach you? Is it when a project is in construction, or is it when the project is already in operation and a community wants to buy? Because the risk exposure is quite different, right? So when does it happen?
I would say anytime, any of those times. Of course, your risk is higher at the beginning, but your price is lower too, right? So it can be attractive to get in, before it is completely constructed. We have a very low risk tolerance, so we are very careful about those situations, which is why we haven't done a lot of them. We are more comfortable with operating assets, but I think the most important thing is to decide what your approach is in those various situations, and then stick to that so people understand what they can expect. Because when people understand what they can expect, then they will embark on the negotiations. Large scale infrastructure projects, as you know, are many, many months in just standard negotiations. And so, no one wants to invest that amount of time without knowing what the end game is. So you have to keep the goalposts constant and your expectations level, so that and communicate them over and over so people understand how they can do this. And the second thing is, I would just say, be creative. Try to think outside of the box. My team wakes up every day. We're still coming up with new solutions and new ideas on how we can bring these things to life. And every jurisdiction has a unique context. So the context in Colombia is different than it might be in Costa Rica, is different than it might be in Ecuador. is different than it is in Alberta, and the context in Alberta is different than Saskatchewan, and so on. So even across Canada, the loan guarantee programs, they are designed to operate together. We have taken some leadership to say, let's work together, but they are all have their individual nuances about how they operate. And I think there is some magic in that. It's not the easiest path, but it is also the most rewarding.
Got it. And my final question is, I think you are very good at reading a room, and and so when a group comes to your door and you have the corporate partner and the community partner, and you're looking at them for the first time, what gives you a hint that this is going to work well? And on the contrary, what makes you think that this is going to be longer than expected?
Okay, well, I would say I'm an optimist one. So I think anything can be done where there is will. If the two parties want to find a path through, if they are genuinely at the table to find a path through, they will find it. So, and we will help them find it. But you have to be committed and you have to be open-minded, and sometimes you need to really remember what brought you to the table in the first place. Always anchor yourself in why you're there. And then I think you can move mountains. I really do. And so, and I've seen our team do it. I've seen the results here. It is not always easy, but it is, it can be done, and it's exciting, and it really can be transformational for everyone in your country, not just the Indigenous people.
Thank you. Well, I was going to say that I hoped everyone who connected today appreciated how much of a privilege it was and it has been for us to speak with you and to listen to your story and your experience. But what I have seen is that the same amount of participants who connected at the very beginning has
Yes.
stayed hooked
Oh,
and
amazing.
connected throughout the full hour. So that is an indicator of how much interest the conversation has sparked.
Oh, well, thank you. And I want to say thank you to all of you for sharing your time with me and allowing us to share our story with you. I always think it's the greatest of honors, actually, that people spend their time. It's your most precious resource to hear. And so I just I hope that you left with a smile on your face. I hope you leave with some optimism for the future and about your ability to do this. I really think it can be done. Like I said, everyone has different opportunities and different challenges, but where there's a will, there's a way.
You've left us energized, Shana. Thank you so much.
Okay, well then I've done my job for today.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. And thank you everybody who has connected today.
Pues muchísimas gracias, Shana, por la intervención clara y sustantiva y toda la información que nos compartiste y la generosidad con que compartiste este espacio con nosotros. Hoy nos llevamos un mensaje muy clave y es que el acceso a capital no es un obstáculo insalvable para la implementación de este tipo de modelos. Requieren arquitectura institucional, reglas claras, mecanismos de mitigación de riesgos bien diseñados y, por supuesto, como le dijo Shana al final, muchísima innovación, muchísimo pensar fuera de la caja y la intencionalidad certera tanto de las empresas, de las comunidades y de la institucionalidad de querer avanzar en la implementación de estos nuevos modelos innovadores de participación. Este webinar cierra formalmente nuestra primera serie de webinars en el marco de nuestro proyecto de UK Pact, pero por supuesto que no cierra la conversación. El propósito de este ciclo ha sido reducir las brechas de información, elevar el nivel técnico del debate y crear unas condiciones para que las organizaciones en Colombia puedan analizar y explorar este modelo de manera informada y estructurada. Esperamos haber logrado este propósito. Agradecemos profundamente a UK Pact por el respaldo a esta iniciativa y a todos los que se han conectado con nosotros a través de los 4 webinars por participar activamente en este proceso y mostrar un genuino interés en que Colombia pueda adaptar modelos innovadores de desarrollo de proyectos de energías renovables hacia el futuro. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos hoy y una feliz tarde para todos.